It is a few minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, and the sky above the Normandy coast is full of noise that should not be there. Somewhere over the village of Merville-Franceville, a formation of Douglas Dakotas ploughs through banks of cloud at 400 meters, engines roaring, flak bursting orange in the dark around them. Inside one aircraft, a young private grips his static line and stares at the open door, at the black, nothing beyond it, waiting for a green light that will decide whether he lives to see the sunrise. Below him, hidden behind barbed wire and a belt of mines 200 meters deep, sits a concrete fortress that could turn the entire invasion into a slaughter before it has properly begun. This is the Merville Battery, 4 squat casemates of reinforced concrete perched on a low rise a few kilometers east of the mouth of the River Orne. British intelligence believes it houses heavy coastal guns capable of reaching out over the sea and smashing the invasion fleet, and, more importantly, raining shells directly onto Sword Beach, the easternmost of the 5 landing zones chosen for Operation Overlord. If those guns are still firing when the first landing craft touch sand, the men waiting ashore will do so under a curtain of high explosive with nowhere to hide. Someone has to reach that battery before dawn. Someone has to silence it, by hand, with explosives and bayonets, before a single ship comes within range. That someone is the 9th Parachute Battalion, and what happens to them over the next few hours will become one of the most remarkable, most badly mauled, and most successful small unit actions of the entire Normandy campaign. The stakes are almost impossible to overstate. Sword Beach carries the invasion's left flank, the hinge on which the whole eastern half of the landings turns. A battery of heavy guns sighted within range of that beach is not simply an inconvenience, it is a potential catastrophe, the sort of single point of failure that planners lie awake worrying about. And this is precisely why, in the weeks before the invasion, an entire battalion of paratroopers has been pulled out of the line, sworn to total secrecy, and set to rehearsing an assault on a target they are forbidden even to name aloud. Why does this matter now, more than 80 years later? Because the story of Merville is not really a story about guns at all. It is a story about what happens when a meticulously planned operation collapses within minutes of contact with reality, and about the extraordinary improvisation of the men left to carry it out regardless. It is a story that strips away the tidy narrative of D-Day as a smoothly executed master plan and reveals something closer to the truth: chaos, courage, and a colonel who refused to accept that failure was an option. By the spring of 1944, Allied planners staring at aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Normandy coast had identified a serious problem. German coastal artillery, part of the sprawling network of fortifications known as the Atlantic Wall, was scattered along the shoreline in concrete emplacements designed to shred any invasion force attempting to land. Most of these positions could be neutralized or at least suppressed by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment on the morning of the assault. Merville, however, was different. Photographic interpretation suggested the casemates there had walls up to 2 meters thick, capable of shrugging off anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest bombs available, and even those had a poor record against hardened concrete. Worse, intelligence gathered through the French resistance, including a detailed report smuggled out by a local woman working near the site, suggested the guns themselves were around 150 millimeters in caliber, weapons with a range comfortably covering the entire stretch of Sword Beach and the anchorage where the invasion fleet would gather. Bombing alone was judged unreliable. On the night of the invasion itself, more than 100 RAF Lancasters would eventually drop over Merville, and the raid would still fail to knock out the casemates. The bombs falling wide of a target so heavily camouflaged and so precisely built that even saturation bombing could not guarantee a kill. Naval bombardment offered another option, but firing blind at a target that might already have been evacuated or relocated risked wasting shells needed elsewhere, and there was no guarantee a warship could silence the guns before they got off a single devastating salvo into the landing craft below. This left planners with an uncomfortable conclusion. The only way to be certain the battery was destroyed, decisively and on schedule, was to send men in on the ground, to blow the guns apart with hand-carried explosives, and to do it before first light so that when the invasion fleet arrived, the threat was already gone. It was a task that demanded precision timing, specialist engineering skill, and a level of coordination between glider pilots, parachute infantry, and pathfinders that had rarely been attempted at this scale. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Land in the wrong place, lose too much equipment on the drop, or arrive even an hour late, and the entire eastern flank of the invasion would be exposed to exactly the bombardment the planners feared most. There was also the matter of timing across the whole invasion front. Every element of Overlord, from the naval bombardment groups to the airborne landings either side of the beachhead, operated on a schedule measured in minutes rather than hours. The Merville assault had to be complete and reported by wireless before a fixed cutoff, because if no signal came through confirming the battery was silenced, the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Arethusa stood ready to fire on the position instead, a solution planners regarded as a poor substitute, given the uncertainty over whether naval gunfire alone could finish the job. This backup plan tells its own story about how little confidence anyone placed in bombardment as a reliable means of destroying the casemates outright. The whole burden, in the end, rested on a single battalion, succeeding where bombs and shells might fail. Responsibility for solving this problem fell to Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway and the roughly 750 men of the 9th Parachute Battalion, part of the 3rd Parachute Brigade within Major General Richard Gale's 6th Airborne Division. Training took place in strict secrecy at a site in southern England, where engineers constructed a full-scale replica of the battery, built using the dimensions and layout gleaned from aerial photographs and the smuggled resistance report. Otway drilled his men on this mock-up repeatedly, day and night, rehearsing every phase of the assault until, in theory, each soldier could complete his individual task blind. The plan itself was a layered piece of military choreography. Pathfinders would drop first to mark the landing zones with hooded lamps and radio beacons, giving the main force something fixed to navigate towards in darkness and unfamiliar terrain. The bulk of the battalion would then parachute in and assemble at a rendezvous point, moving from there to breach the outer minefield and wire using Bangalore torpedoes, explosive-packed tubes designed to blast a corridor through obstacles roughly the width of a domestic hallway. Engineers rehearsed laying these charges blindfolded, on the theory that smoke, dust, and darkness on the night itself would leave them working almost by feel alone. While the ground assault pushed through the gaps, 3 Horsa-gliders carrying a small specialist team would be released to land directly inside the battery perimeter itself, a maneuver intended to strike the guns from within at the precise moment the perimeter assault went in, catching the German garrison between 2 simultaneous threats. Engineers carried specially designed explosive charges shaped to fit the barrels and breeches of the guns, intended to render them permanently unusable rather than merely damaged, charges roughly the size and weight of a rolled newspaper but capable of splitting a steel gun barrel apart. Diversionary measures included dummy paratroopers, nicknamed Ruperts, weighted effigies fitted with small pyrotechnic charges designed to simulate rifle fire on landing, dropped elsewhere along the coast to draw German attention away from the real objective. Otway also arranged for a Royal Air Force bombing raid to strike the battery shortly before the ground assault began, not in the expectation that it would destroy the casemates outright, but in the hope that it might cut paths through the surrounding minefield and disorient the garrison inside. Reconnaissance photographs taken in the days before the invasion were updated constantly, and the model used for training back in England was revised as fresh intelligence arrived, down to the positioning of individual machine gun posts along the perimeter. By the last week of May, Otway judged his men as ready as training could make them, though he privately doubted, as any experienced officer might, that a plan this intricate would survive contact with an actual battlefield. On paper, it was elegant. In the air over Normandy that night, it fell apart almost immediately. Thick cloud, intense anti-aircraft fire, and navigational errors among the transport air crews scattered the drop badly. Of the roughly 750 men who should have assembled at the rendezvous, barely 150 managed to find their way there in the darkness, many without their weapons, having lost equipment containers in fields and hedgerows kilometers from the intended drop zone. The specialist mine-clearing gear, much of the ammunition, and most of the heavier support weapons simply never arrived. Of the 3 gliders meant to land inside the battery itself, one was shot down before release, and the other 2 missed the target in the confusion, coming down some distance away. Otway now faced a decision that would define the entire operation. He had roughly a fifth of his intended force, almost none of the specialist equipment his plan depended upon, and a deadline measured in minutes rather than hours, because the naval bombardment supporting the wider landings was due to commence at a fixed time regardless of what happened on the ground. He chose to attack anyway. What followed was less a set-piece assault than a desperate, close-quarters brawl fought largely with what men could carry in their hands. Gaps were blown through the wire using whatever explosive charges remained, smaller and less reliable than the specialist equipment lost in the drop. Paratroopers crossed the minefield on foot, in places crawling through gaps torn by earlier bombing, accepting casualties as the price of speed. Inside the perimeter, fighting became hand-to-hand, grenades tossed into casemate entrances, bayonets used at close range in the dark, and smoke. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, it costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making films like this one. When the surviving paratroopers finally forced their way into the casemates, they discovered something that has since become one of the more debated footnotes of the operation. The guns inside were not the feared 150mm pieces described in pre-invasion intelligence, but smaller Czech-made 75mm field guns, still dangerous, still capable of reaching sword beach, but a different order of threat to what the planners had prepared for. Whatever their caliber, the guns were disabled using the explosives and equipment still on hand, their breech mechanisms wrecked beyond quick repair. By the time the operation was declared complete, Otway's force had suffered roughly 70 casualties, killed or wounded, out of the small number who had actually reached the objective, a casualty rate that by any measure counts among the heaviest suffered by any single British unit that morning. Set against other Allied attempts to neutralize coastal batteries that same day, Merville stands out for both its method and its cost. At Point du Hoc, further west along the coast, American Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder scaled sheer cliffs under fire using rope ladders and grapnel hooks, only to discover on reaching the summit that the guns they had come to destroy had already been withdrawn inland, replaced with telegraph poles as decoys. It was an extraordinary feat of physical daring that nonetheless achieved its strategic purpose almost by accident. The real guns eventually located and destroyed some distance from the original position. Merville, by contrast, involved no cliffs, but demanded an even more complex airborne insertion, and unlike Point du Hoc, the guns were exactly where intelligence said they would be, fully manned and ready to fire. Elsewhere, along the invasion front, batteries at Azaville and Crispec, defending the approaches to Utah Beach, proved so stubbornly resistant that American infantry needed days rather than hours to subdue them fully, a reminder that not every coastal fortress fell as quickly or as dramatically as Merville. German coastal defenses generally relied on concrete protection and interlocking fields of fire rather than mobility, a doctrine that made them formidable against direct assault, but also, as at Merville, vulnerable once attackers had physically breached the wire, since the guns themselves could not easily be turned to face an enemy already inside the perimeter. The material impact of the raid remains a subject of genuine historical debate. Some accounts suggest the smaller 75mm guns discovered inside the casemates would in any case have struggled to inflict the catastrophic damage originally feared, raising the uncomfortable possibility that Otway's men paid a heavy price to neutralize a threat that had already been somewhat overstated by earlier intelligence. What is far less disputed is the psychological and operational value of removing all doubt. Commanders overseeing the Sword Beach landings that morning did not have the luxury of hoping the battery was less dangerous than believed. They needed certainty, and Otway's assault, however costly and however chaotic in execution, delivered exactly that. German forces did briefly reoccupy the position later that same day, and the guns required further attention before the position was permanently secured, a detail often left out of the more triumphant tellings of the story. The 9th Parachute Battalion's action at Merville went on to influence how airborne planners thought about contingency and improvisation in the years that followed, a case study in what happens when the elegant plan disintegrates and success depends instead on the initiative of a handful of men on the ground. Military historians have returned to it repeatedly as an example of mission command in practice, the principle that a commander given a clear objective should be trusted to achieve it by whatever means circumstances allow, rather than being bound rigidly to a plan that assumes a battlefield will behave as expected. Otway himself survived the war and spoke about the raid for decades afterwards, always careful to credit the ordinary soldiers who reached the objective rather than the plan that had, by his own admission, largely fallen apart before it began. Today, visitors can walk through the original Casemate No. 1 at the site near Merville-Franceville, preserved as a museum alongside a restored Dakota transport aircraft of the type that carried the paratroopers that night. Information panels and a small exhibition set out the operation in detail, and the surrounding fields, quiet now and given over to farmland, offer little hint of the wire, mines, and machine gun positions that once made this patch of Norman coastline one of the most dangerous few acres in Europe. It remains a modest, unglamorous sort of memorial, entirely in keeping with an operation remembered less for its polish than for the sheer, stubborn persistence of the men who carried it out. Return for a moment to that Dakota door in the small hours of June 6th, to the young private staring out into darkness he cannot see through, waiting for a green light. He does not know, as he steps out into the night, that his aircraft has drifted kilometers from where it should be, that his battalion will assemble with barely a fifth of its intended strength, that the mine-clearing equipment he trained with for weeks will end up scattered uselessly across the Normandy countryside. He knows only his task, rehearsed until it lived in his hands without conscious thought, and he carries it out anyway, alongside 150 other men who found their way to the same fight through the same chaos. What was achieved that night was not the plan Otway had drilled into his men for weeks. It was something rougher, costlier, and in its own way more remarkable. A battalion reduced to a fraction of its strength that nonetheless fought its way into a fortress and silenced the guns inside it before the invasion fleet came within range. 70 men fell doing it. The guns fell silent because of it. Sword Beach opened that morning without the bombardment planners had feared most, and whether the guns inside those casemates could truly have delivered the catastrophe once predicted no longer mattered, because no one was left to find out the hard way. This is what the Merville raid ultimately represents. Not the triumph of a perfect plan, but the triumph of men who kept fighting after the plan was already in ruins. The battery had to be silenced. It was silenced. Everything else, the scattered drops, the missing equipment, the smaller-than-expected guns, the questions historians still argue over today, is detail layered on top of that single, stubborn fact. Before the sun rose properly over the Normandy coast on June 6, 1944, 150 exhausted paratroopers had done what an entire battalion had been trained to do, and they had done it with almost nothing left but their own determination to see it through.